Hey guys, welcome back to the Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People's Story. It all started 2 months ago when I finally closed on my dream property. After years of apartment living in the city, I'd saved enough for a down payment on a modest house with a decent chunk of land attached to it. The property was about 3 acres total, with the house sitting toward the front near the road and a beautiful stretch of wooded area in the back that bordered a small creek. Perfect for someone like me who works from home as an environmental consultant and craves a bit of nature. The neighborhood was governed by an HOA, which initially gave me pause. I've heard enough horror stories about power-hungry board members making life miserable over petty infractions, but the rules seemed reasonable when I reviewed them before purchasing, mostly focused on keeping the front-facing parts of properties looking maintained and cohesive. The best part was that the back portion of my land, being largely wooded and not visible from the street, had minimal restrictions. I did my due diligence before signing anything. I reviewed the property survey, checked the exact boundaries, and even paid for my own independent survey to confirm everything matched up. I knew exactly where my land began and ended. The previous owner had let the back area grow wild for years, which actually appealed to me. I had plans to create a small wildlife sanctuary back there, with native plants to support local bird and insect populations. For the first month, I focused on settling into the house itself. I painted a few rooms, arranged furniture, and set up my home office. The neighbors seemed friendly enough, with most giving a polite wave when we crossed paths, though few went out of their way to introduce themselves. That was fine by me. I've always been more of a private person anyway. Then came that fateful Saturday in June when everything went sideways. I woke up early, made a strong cup of coffee, and decided today was the day to start clearing some of the overgrown areas in the back of my property. I'd been planning this for weeks, researching which invasive species to remove first and which native plants to eventually introduce. I put on my work clothes, sturdy boots, work gloves, and a wide-brimmed hat to shield me from the sun. I gathered my tools, a chainsaw for some of the larger dead branches that needed clearing, loppers for the smaller stuff, and several large yard waste bags. Around 9 a.m., I started working. The morning was pleasant, not too hot yet, with birds singing as I carefully began removing some of the invasive honeysuckle that was choking out native vegetation. I was being selective, only removing what was necessary as I wanted to maintain as much of the natural environment as possible while making it healthier. About an hour into my work, I had this weird feeling of being watched. You know that prickly sensation on the back of your neck? I looked up and noticed a woman standing at what I knew was the edge of my property, arms crossed, staring at me with obvious disapproval. She was probably in her 60s, with a meticulously styled gray bob and designer sunglasses perched on her nose. She wore pressed khaki shorts and a polo shirt with what looked like the HOA logo embroidered on it. If there was ever a walking stereotype of an HOA enforcer, this was it. I gave her a friendly wave and went back to work, figuring she was just curious about the new neighbor. But a few minutes later, I heard someone clearing their throat loudly behind me. I turned to find her standing much closer, having crossed onto my property, her face pinched with irritation. "Excuse me," she said in a tone that suggested I'd personally offended her. "What exactly do you think you're doing here?" I straightened up, wiped some sweat from my brow, and smiled politely. "Just clearing some invasive species. I'm the new owner of this property." She looked me up and down, taking in my sweaty work clothes and dirt-smudged face with obvious distaste. "This is protected HOA common area. You can't just come in here and start destroying things." I blinked in confusion. "Ma'am, I think there's a misunderstanding. This is my property. I purchased it 2 months ago." She let out a scoffing sound that somehow managed to be both dismissive and condescending. "Young man, I've lived in this neighborhood for 23 years. I'm on the HOA board. I know exactly where all the property lines are, and you are currently trespassing on community land. This wooded area is part of our natural preserve." I took a deep breath, reminding myself to stay calm. "I understand you've lived here a long time, but I've seen the property survey. This land belongs to my lot. The boundary is about 15 feet behind you, marked by those orange stakes." I pointed to the survey markers I'd carefully checked just last week. She didn't even turn to look at them. "Those stakes don't mean anything. The previous owner tried to claim this land too, but we straightened him out. The HOA boundary extends to the creek. Everyone knows that." At this point, I realized this wasn't going to be resolved with a simple conversation. "I have the official survey and deed at my house. Would you like me to go get them?" "What I would like," she said, her voice rising, "is for you to stop what you're doing immediately and leave this area. I'm going to have to report this to the full board. We take preservation of our common areas very seriously. I sighed. Look, I'm not trying to be difficult, but this is my property. I paid for it, I have the documentation to prove it, and I'm well within my rights to maintain it. Her face flushed red. Are you refusing to comply with an HOA directive? I'm refusing to leave my own property, yes, I said firmly. That's when she pulled out her phone. Fine, you leave me no choice. I assumed she was going to call another HOA board member, which was fine by me. The more witnesses to this ridiculous situation, the better. But then I heard her say, yes, I need to report a trespasser who is destroying protected land in our neighborhood. She was calling the police. On me. For being on my own property. I stood there in disbelief as she gave the dispatcher my description, making it sound like I was some crazed vandal hacking away at a beloved nature preserve. She even threw in that I was behaving aggressively and had dangerous cutting tools, referring to my perfectly normal garden equipment. When she hung up, she had a smug look of satisfaction. The police will be here shortly. I suggest you put down your tools before they arrive. I shook my head. This is completely unnecessary. I'm going to my house to get my property documents. I'll be right back. You're not going anywhere, she snapped. You'll stay right here until the police arrive. She actually positioned herself to block my path as if she had any authority to detain me. Rather than try to move around her and potentially have her claim I pushed her or something equally ridiculous, I decided to just wait it out. I set down my tools, pulled out my phone, and started recording. What are you doing? She demanded. Documenting this interaction, I replied calmly. Since you've called the police on me for being on my own property, I think it's important to have a record of what's happening. You can't record me without my permission, she shrieked. Actually, we're in a public space. I mean on private property. My property specifically, so I absolutely can, I informed her. She huffed and took a few steps back, but continued to glare at me while we waited. I used the time to text my neighbor from across the street, a friendly retired guy who had welcomed me with a six-pack of local beer when I moved in. I quickly explained the situation and asked if he could bring over a copy of the neighborhood plat map he'd mentioned having during our first conversation. He replied immediately that he was on his way. About 15 minutes later, 2 police officers arrived, looking somewhat confused as they approached through the trees. The woman immediately rushed over to them. Officers, thank goodness you're here. This is the man I called about, she said, pointing at me accusingly. He's trespassing on HOA property and destroying protected woodland. One officer, a tall man with a calm demeanor, looked at me questioningly. Sir, can you explain what's going on here? I lowered my phone but kept it recording in my hand. Officers, I'm OP. I own this property. I purchased it 2 months ago, and I'm simply maintaining the back portion of my land by removing some invasive species. This woman is from the HOA, and seems to believe this is common land, but she's mistaken. I have the property survey to prove it. The second officer, a younger woman, looked around. Do you have property markers? Yes, I said, pointing to the orange stakes. Those mark my property line. As you can see, we're well within those boundaries. The woman from the HOA interrupted. Those are not official markers. The HOA common area extends to the creek as it always has. I've lived here for 23 years and I'm on the board. Just then, my neighbor arrived, carrying a large folded document. He nodded to the officers. Morning. I heard there was some confusion about the property lines. I brought the neighborhood plat map that shows all the official boundaries. The officers examined the map that my neighbor spread out on a relatively flat stump. It clearly showed that my property extended all the way to the creek, exactly as I'd said. The male officer looked up at the HOA woman. Ma'am, according to this official plat map, this land does belong to the homeowner of Lot 27, which I understand is Mr. OP here. Her face reddened further. That map must be outdated. The HOA annexed this area years ago for conservation purposes. That's not how property works, I said. You can't just annex someone's private property. If the HOA wanted this land, they would have had to purchase it from the previous owner, which clearly never happened. The female officer turned to me. Do you have your deed or property survey with you? Not on me, but I can get them from my house in 2 minutes. Please do, she said. I jogged back to my house, careful to stay well within what even the HOA woman would have to acknowledge was my property. I returned with my folder of closing documents, including the official property survey completed just before I purchased the house. The officers reviewed it, then nodded. This confirms what the plat map shows, the male officer said. This is indeed private property belonging to the owner of Lot 27. He turned to the HOA woman whose smugness had been replaced by a look of uncertainty. "Ma'am, it appears there's been a misunderstanding. This is private property, not HOA common land," she stammered. "But we've always... The previous owner let us..." "Whether the previous owner allowed the HOA to use this land informally doesn't change the legal ownership," the female officer explained patiently. "According to these documents, this is Mr. OP's private property," the male officer added. "Which means you're currently trespassing on his land, ma'am." The look on her face was priceless, a mix of shock, embarrassment, and indignation that I wish I could have framed and hung on my wall. "That's impossible," she sputtered. "I'm on the HOA board. I can't be trespassing." I stepped forward, feeling a calm sense of vindication. "Ma'am, I'm the landowner here, and as the officers have confirmed, you're on my property without permission." The female officer turned to her. "I'm going to have to ask you to return to HOA common property or your own home." But, what about him destroying the woodland?" she protested weakly. "Sir, what exactly are you doing here today?" the male officer asked me. I explained my background in environmental consultation and my plans to remove invasive species to create a healthier ecosystem on my property. I showed them the areas I was working on and pointed out the invasive honeysuckle I'd been removing. "That sounds like responsible land management to me," he said. "And regardless, as the property owner, you have the right to maintain your land as you see fit, within zoning regulations." The HOA woman was still standing there, looking increasingly uncomfortable. "Ma'am?" the female officer said more firmly. "You need to leave Mr. OP's property now." Finally, she turned and began walking back toward the front of the neighborhood, but not before saying loud enough for everyone to hear, "The HOA board will be hearing about this." Once she was out of earshot, the male officer turned to me. "Sorry about this disturbance, sir. You're well within your rights to be here and to maintain your property." "I appreciate that, officers, but I'm concerned about potential ongoing harassment from the HOA. She called the police on me for being on my own property and even tried to prevent me from going to my house to get my documents. Is there anything I should do to protect myself going forward?" "I'd recommend documenting any future interactions," the female officer advised. "We'll file a report about today's incident that you can reference if needed." They took my information and provided me with an incident number before departing. My neighbor stayed behind. "Welcome to the neighborhood," he said with a wry smile. "That was Carol. She's been the self-appointed HOA enforcer for as long as I can remember. Most of us just try to stay out of her way." "Thanks for coming to my rescue with that plat map," I said. He shrugged. "No problem. Between you and me, a lot of folks around here will be glad to hear someone finally stood up to her." After he left, I considered my options. I could let it go and hope Carol would leave me alone now that she'd been publicly corrected by the police. But something told me she wasn't the type to admit defeat easily, and if she was going to report me to the HOA board, I needed to get ahead of the situation. That evening, I drafted a formal letter to the HOA board. I detailed the incident, including Carol's false accusations, her calling the police under false pretenses, and her attempt to prevent me from accessing my own home. I attached copies of my property survey, the police incident report number, and stills from the video I'd recorded showing her trespassing on my property after being informed it was private land. I concluded the letter by stating that while I respected the HOA authority within its proper jurisdiction, I would not tolerate harassment, trespassing, or false reports to law enforcement. I requested a formal apology from both Carol and the HOA board, and assurances that such incidents would not be repeated. 3 days later, I received a phone call from the HOA president who sounded rather uncomfortable throughout our conversation. He apologized profusely for the misunderstanding and assured me that Carol had been spoken to about her behavior. He explained that there had indeed been some confusion about that particular section of land, as the previous owner had informally allowed the HOA to treat it as an extension of their nature trail. However, he acknowledged that legally it was my property and I had every right to maintain it as I saw fit. I was polite but firm. I understand there may have been informal arrangements in the past, but calling the police on a homeowner for being on their own property is completely unacceptable. I expect a written apology and assurance this won't happen again. He agreed immediately, seemingly relieved I wasn't threatening legal action. 2 days later, I received a formal letter from the HOA board apologizing for the incident and clarifying that the woodland area behind my home was indeed my private property. They also included a copy of a notice that would be distributed to all homeowners, reminding everyone about respecting property boundaries and proper procedures for addressing concerns. What was conspicuously missing was any personal apology from Carol herself. I wasn't surprised, but I was disappointed. I decided to attend the next monthly HOA meeting to ensure my concerns were properly addressed. When I arrived at the community center for the meeting, I immediately noticed Carol sitting at the board table glaring at me as I entered. I took a seat near the front and waited patiently through the regular business until they opened the floor for homeowner comments. I stood up and introduced myself as the new owner of Lot 27. I want to thank the board for their prompt response to my recent complaint about being harassed on my property and having the police called on me under false pretenses. I received your letter of apology, which I appreciate. However, I noticed that board member Carol, who was directly responsible for this incident, has not personally acknowledged or apologized for her actions. The room went eerily quiet. The HOA president cleared his throat awkwardly. We've addressed this matter internally with all board members. With all due respect, I continued, being publicly accused of crimes on my own property and having the police called on me warrants more than an internal addressing. It warrants a public apology from the person responsible. Carol's face had turned an alarming shade of red. I was acting in what I believed were the best interests of the community, she said stiffly. By trespassing on private property and filing a false police report? I asked calmly. The HOA president intervened before she could respond. Carol, I think a brief apology would be appropriate here. She looked like she was about to refuse, but after a moment of tense silence, she said through gritted teeth, I apologize for the misunderstanding about your property boundaries. It wasn't much, but it was something, and more importantly, it was witnessed by dozens of homeowners who now knew exactly what she had done. Thank you, I said. I accept your apology and consider the matter closed, provided there are no further incidents. After the meeting, several neighbors approached me to introduce themselves. Many shared their own stories of run-ins with Carol over the years. It seemed I wasn't the first to experience her overzealous enforcement tactics, just the first to successfully challenge her in such a public way. Over the next few weeks, I continued working on my wildlife sanctuary project without further incident. I noticed Carol's infamous patrol golf cart would make wide detours to avoid passing my house. Whenever we happened to cross paths in the neighborhood, she would quickly look away and hurry in the opposite direction. The most satisfying development came about a month later, when notices went out for the annual HOA board elections. Carol, who had apparently served on the board for 15 consecutive years, decided not to run for re-election. The neighbor who told me this news couldn't hide his grin. Rumor has it she couldn't handle the loss of credibility after the property line incident, as everyone's calling it now. My wildlife sanctuary project is flourishing now. I've removed most of the invasive species, planted dozens of native trees and shrubs, and even built a small observation deck where I can sit quietly and watch the birds and other wildlife that have been attracted to the improved habitat. Sometimes neighbors stop by to admire the transformation, often commenting on how much better the area looks now that it's being properly maintained. As for Carol, she still lives in the neighborhood but keeps a much lower profile these days. I've heard she's channeled her energy into her garden, which I suppose is a healthier outlet for her controlling tendencies. We don't speak, but we've reached a state of mutual avoidance that works for both of us. Looking back, I'm glad I stood my ground that day, not just for myself, but for all the neighbors who had been intimidated by Carol's tactics for years. Sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to say, no, this isn't right, to change a long-standing power dynamic. And every time I sit on my observation deck, watching hummingbirds flit among the native flowers I planted, I can't help but smile at the memory of Carol's face when the police officer told her she was the one trespassing. Some lessons are harder to learn than others, but they tend to be the ones that stick. The next one is a pro-revenge story. The setup I live in one of those doubled-up houses where they build two houses adjacent to each other with mirrored layout, so we share a wall but are otherwise completely separate. For years, the house next to me belonged to a nice old lady who you never really noticed or had any trouble with. When she died and the house was resold, the troubles began. The target is someone who I will refer to as Jack Sparrow, for reasons that will become clear later. Jack owns a sizable construction business, does some real estate on the side. He buys the house and rents it to a bunch of foreign construction workers that work for his business. I say foreign because it is relevant to the story. There are rumors Jack is doing some shady stuff to have these work for him dirt cheap by claiming that they're national workers in their native country, and paying them according to that wage, and not the much higher minimum wage of my country. Not exactly on the up and up, possibly unreported labor as well. Anyways, he stuffs 6 of these in said house for them to live while they work here. Now, I do not have anything against foreign construction workers, but these guys living next door have 2 traits that are very problematic. They are extremely loud, and they do not give a duck about anyone else. We're talking non-stop music and partying starting Thursday evening throughout the entire weekend until they leave at 5 a.m. Monday morning to go to work. Seriously, I don't know how or when they sleep. It is literally non-stop. We're talking I'm wearing headphones but still cannot hear my own sound over their music. Loud, since it would appear that they've designated the living room, adjacent to the shared wall, as the party room where the fun happens. At first, I do the neighborly thing and just suck it up, thinking, it's just one party, just one weekend. After the third one in a row, I go over to ask them to turn it down, since, night disturbance, it's technically illegal to blast music this loud, hearable on the street and across the street by my other neighbors who have also complained. I'm met with a half-hearthed, so sorry, we'll fix, except nothing changes. I go over several more times, each time angrier, each time met with, but it's not loud. If I can hear your music in my own house, over my own TV and music, I would say that it is in fact too loud. I contact Jack, since he is their landlord, and explain the situation, after which I'm met with an abrupt, sorry, not my ducking problem. Basically, Jack told me to get ducked, so I involve police and call them every time things get out of hand. After about a dozen calls, sometimes even twice in the same night, it is clear that even regular police interference doesn't help the situation. I should mention that I am a lawyer, so I know what the next legal steps are. I also know that other than a token paper from a judge saying their music is too loud, I'm not really going to get anything. Things would, like they already sometimes had, become a cat and mouse game where they would blast their music extremely loud to piss me off or to wake me up for a few brief moments so that by the time I could get proof or police show up, there would be no music. I'm deadlocked with my only further option being pretty useless and a waste of time. At this point, I'm biding my time and just waiting till something changes. I'm not saying that I condone people who bludgeon their neighbor to death with a rusty pipe, but I do somewhat understand what would drive someone to that point. The mistake. One day I'm at home and I notice quite a lot of ruckus next door, more so than usual. Suddenly, I see through my garden window that a wall is being partially torn down. You see, sometime over the years, the neighbors had built a small adjacent side building adjoining the main house. It was right on the border between us, and when the gardens were being refenced, the wall was used as a divider to save on fencing. Said wall was now in the process of having its top part ripped off by a crane. I was not informed of any of this, which, while not technically needed, would have been the nice thing to do. I go take a walk so I can take a look at what we're doing and see that they've torn down the entire side building. The remaining wall between our gardens is the only part that has been kept intact, and even then, not the top part. Being a lawyer, and specifically a construction permit lawyer, I know two things. Crap like this is not allowed without a pre-approved permit from the city. There is no way in hell they have said permit, as I would have seen the application for it. I regularly have to check the online, public, accessible by everyone application to see what permits are being applied for my job, and when I do, I tend to look over to my own area, just so I can keep up with what is being planned in my area. This is it. The moment I have been waiting for, the situation has changed, and the time has come to exact revenge. A quick email sent to the municipal authorities lets me do my civic duty of reporting a potential crime. The fact that someone is building or demolishing crap without a permit. Since this is a simple report, no response happens since I'm not an official victim or anything yet. Since no further construction happens for a few days and everything was removed, I assume that was that and they would only tear down the side structure since it was starting to fall apart due to age. Neighbors have moved all their stuff that was in said building onto their lawn and haphazardly covered it with a tarp. The next week, more construction materials are being delivered and construction starts. I send a new email to city services with new pictures saying that apparently there is more planned and that I hope they undertake the appropriate action. Instant response less than an hour later. They'd called Jack after the first time to inform him that what he was doing required a permit, and he had assured them that he didn't know that BS, he's in construction, of course he knows, and that he would stop construction and request a permit. They called him again after my email, reprimanded him for not following his earlier promise, and he said again he would shut it down. I happened to be working from home that day and had to stop myself from waving to the construction crew as they left. Later that day, I get an angry phone call from Jack who accuses me of reporting him and that I would be sorry. He would come after me for damages for his delays. I respectfully inform him that even if I reported him, reports are in my name but not published and anonymized in later files. I wouldn't have done anything wrong, because from the looks of it, he didn't have a permit and should have known that before he started working illegally without one. I end the call before I start to sound too happy with things. Jack has at this point no idea what I have initiated with this. He is Jack Sparrow, and I have just rung the bell that awakens the Kraken that will destroy him. He just doesn't know it yet. The Kraken. You see, There is a good reason why most people consult an expert and/or a lawyer when they want to apply for a permit. The rules involved are so convoluted and needlessly complex that navigating them as a non-professional is extremely hard and time-consuming, and a single mistake can torpedo your entire case, forcing you to do it all over. I have killed entire projects and have seen clients' projects killed. By pointing out that on page 127, section 35(1)(a), something was left blank that should have been answered. I did some digging and found out that the previous owners of the houses had actually consulted each other about the side building and agreed on making the wall part of the divider between their gardens. So much so that they shared the costs of it and the ownership. That wall that he destroyed part of, it was also my wall. Which of course means I'm entitled to damages, but that is not the important part. The important part is that he needs my permission to do anything to that wall. So when he applied for a permit a few weeks later, added bonus, rowdy neighbors' stuff is still out in the open, covered by just a tarp, since they expected this to be a quick smash and replace job that would take a few weeks at most. I went to City Center and looked at the application. Noticed that they were planning to do some stuff to said wall that I own 50%, so I filed a complaint following proper procedure about the permit, namely that even if granted, it could never be executed since Jack needed permission from me in regards to the wall, and he didn't have it, nor was I intending to grant it. This should kill his permit, since permits cannot be granted if you know in advance they cannot be realized. No sense granting a permit to build a certain kind of house when you know they're never actually going to build it. Now, Jack was a bit of a smooth talker, and as a construction entrepreneur, had his connections, and permits are a political decision here just as much as a legal one. So despite a 100% correct legal objection that should have killed his permit, it went through. He actually called me about it to gloat a little. No worry, one can appeal a permit in my country. The only requirement is that you pay a €100 fee, which I gladly paid. The appeal instance is a sub-national instance and does not care one bit about Jack's political ties or the half-hearted bullcrap that the city officials wrote to justify granting the permit in spite of the concerns I raised. They terminate his permit without any hesitation on the aforementioned legal grounds. Jack sees his permit blocked until he fixes the issue, which he can't, because I'm not really inclined to agree with his plans for our wall, you see. At this point, going through 2 lengthy procedures, it has been over 7 months. The neighbors have had an unfinished construction project in their yard the entire time, forced to store their stuff elsewhere. Something that was always supposed to be a temporary thing for a few weeks while we build, turned into something that was taking months with no end in sight. But wait, there's more. The above was the administrative part of the matter, him getting the permit. Now, doing construction work without a permit is also a criminal offense. And of course, my report got passed around to the appropriate instances, so now Jack was also the subject of a criminal procedure for construction offense. Not only did he risk fines and jail time, he was a construction business and used his own construction business for the work he did on the property. So his company was also on the hook, and one of the sentences that can be given in these types of crimes is to be prohibited to do construction or construction-related activity as a business, either permanently or temporarily. Not only was he personally on the line, his entire business was as well. During this debacle, Jack tried to sell the property. This didn't really go too well because of a few reasons. One, the property was inflicted with an illegal situation. The demolished side building was torn down illegally, and until said illegal status was resolved, it would stick to the property, which tends to kill the property value quite a bit, since nobody wants to buy something that they'll have to spend time and money on to make legal again by either rebuilding the torn down building or getting a regularization permit for it, made even worse by the fact that he applied for said permit and had it denied, so he couldn't even claim that said permit would be super easy to get. Secondly, is Jack never intended to sell the property in its current state. What he, as I now know, has done in the past is buy cheap old houses like the one next to me. He puts some of his crew in it, who can't complain about the subpar accommodation. They thrash the place because they don't care, and he lets them. Then when the place is done, he tears it down and sells it to a developer or develops it himself. However, due to his construction crime and the accompanying status for the property, step 2 was not an option. He couldn't renovate it the way it needed to be. Small renovations would not be enough, because covering the crime was always a requirement in any permit he would request for the building, and because of me, he couldn't cover it. Couldn't sell it either because the place was trashed, and any developer looking at it would dip out when they realized there was a construction issue, and a vocal neighbor who would oppose anything big that they would try to do there, lost of easier properties to develop than that one. In conclusion, anyway, that is where we are today. Jack is staring down the barrel of a criminal court procedure that is about to happen where he is risking his business and livelihood. His existing projects also gather special attention from city services now, since he is now outed to them as someone who cuts corners on permits and regulations. He cannot really sell the property unless he cuts a massive loss, since in its current state it is absolutely trashed. He cannot develop it or sell to a developer because all development plans involve the adjoining wall, which he cannot use in big ways unless he gets my permission. The rowdy neighbors are stuck living in a smaller house than what they had, in a place they trashed, but that cannot really be renovated or fixed in the major way that it needs. They have quieted down a lot, possibly because Jack blames them for his current situation, which isn't wrong, I suppose. I have awakened the Kraken and set it off on Jack Sparrow, and it utterly ruined him. And the best part is that I had due to very little to do it. All I really did was nudge the abomination that is municipal bureaucracy and point it in his direction, and they did the rest. I could tell you that he called me to complain and even beg about letting him use the wall the way he needs it to, so that he can get on with his business and fix the issues and use them to show his good faith in court in the criminal procedure, that he was losing money and customers over this and was in danger of losing his entire business, and that I then smugly replied with not my ducking problem. But he didn't. So, for now we'll just have to imagine that he did. Thank you for watching. I would really appreciate it if you could like the video and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. We'll see you again tomorrow.